Well, you've made it to part 5, the final part of our little acrylic painting demo. We're painting some geraniums in the garden today, and we're moving into the last sections of this little painting. And this is where I'm taking a lot of time and just looking at the painting, putting in some highlights and some darks, and just reevaluating where the painting is and where it might be going. Here I've gone with a light white, and one thing about white is that looks very white, but it's actually got a little bit of a blue in it. So, you just want to be careful with using pure white. A little bit of yellow, a little bit of blue is always good. I have so much worms in this painting that oftentimes I'll put a little bit of yellow in the white for the highlights, but in this case I went with the blue just as a contrast to all the worms in the paintings more than anything else. I'm using a tiny little brush. I'm not even sure what number that brush is, and it's also a synthetic brush, and I'm just lightly touching in some highlights on the edge of these petals to get them to stand out and come forward a little bit. I had established in my original drawing that this little focal area was where I wanted most of my highlights. So that's where I'm trying to put them at this point. You can see how I kind of lay the brush down and roll it. And after I put in some of these highlights, what I'll do is, again, rinse my brush, mostly dry it out, and then I'm coming in here right now and softening those interior edges. I don't want to put down a really graphic blob of paint. I want it to look more natural and have one soft edge and one hard edge, which will, I think, be more dramatic and more effective. Just scrubbing in those edges. You can do this for a little while in acrylic paint, but after a while it's going to start drying out, so you won't be able to affect it. But as long as you come back in within a minute or two, you can soften out those edges. Now I'm coming back in with some darks, some dark greens that I've made with some Alizarin Crimson in there, some Ultramarine, and you can see me mixing that up and then adding some Quinacridone Gold and a little Phthalo Blue as well. Again, my darkest darks I always make with Pthalo Blue, Alizarin Crimson, and Quinacridone Gold because it's a very transparent dark. So I'm coming back in and establishing those few little dark areas. And see how when I put those darks in around the light green of those leaves, they seem to jump out more. I also just want to establish in the darker areas some texture and some interest. I don't want it just to be one flat black. So I bring in different levels of blackness and a little bit of pure ultramarine blue in there too. Again, that's something I like to do in the darks, is put in some pure ultramarine or some pure alizarin crimson just for a little pop of color. Spent quite a bit of time with this little area of buds. I didn't want it to stand out, but I really like the way the geranium buds are, the way the form of them and the shape of them. So I wanted to get that in there, but I didn't want it to really stand out with a lot of detail. Going back and forth in this corner, adding some darks in. Again, going with that swoopy nature of the geranium leaf, the way it has a kind of a curving nature to it, its gesture, I guess you would say, and trying to give you hints of that so you know that this is a geranium plant. A little bit of highlights on those buds that are underneath the flowers, and then coming back in with some more white. So at this point, I think I've done about all I want to do, and I think I'm done with it. I'm going to leave it now for a few days and see if I like where I'm at. Okay, at this point, I've looked at the painting for a couple of days, and there's certain areas in it that are bothering me. Okay, the first thing that's bothering me is that these areas here, right up against the edge of the painting, are very chromatic, very bright, and they're catching my eye. They're bringing my eye away from this area, which is the focal point. So one of the things I'm going to adjust is I'm going to go into these areas and I'm going to dull them down, darken them, lighten them, whatever it's going to take to make them not quite so obvious, because right now they're very warm and they're very chromatic, they're very richly colored, and they're just grabbing my eye. I also don't like the shape of this one. It's very geometric and hard-edged, and that's drawing my attention. So I'm going to fix that. I also don't like this little spot right here, which is very dark, and it's against a very light area. And again, this dark area is as dark as the darks in my focal point, so I don't like that, and it's something I want to fix. Just another small area that I don't really like is how hard the edges are, sharp the edges are along here. They're very cut out looking, and they don't seem to fold back as much as I'd want them to. So I think that's all of the areas I'm going to address, but that's just something I do at this point in the painting, is just live with it for a couple of days and decide if there's anything that I want to fix before I go on and sign it and finish it up. So let's see if we can address those areas. All right, so let's see if we can fix those areas that we were talking about. The first thing I'm doing is making a very watery wash of a purple color and trying to just dull out those areas a little bit. This is something that you can do with your paintings. It's when you just want to change an overall feel, slightly darker. You obviously can't go slightly lighter or lighter with this kind of a technique, but it can be very effective. And you can also integrate your whole painting by just putting a thin wash of the same color over a large area. In this case, I started with that, but it wasn't really working for me. In reality, I need to make these areas a little bit lighter, and so there isn't as much of a value difference between the sky and the flower. So remember, whenever there's a big value difference, that's going to draw the eye and the attention. The other thing that bothered me about this flower up against the edge is you can see it's almost the same size and shape as the focal point flower, and that's not going to work so well either. You always want to vary your sizes and your shapes whenever you do a painting. So I'm coming back in with some of my sky color, which was, as you remember, primarily phthalo blue with white, more of a cool blue. And I'm altering the actual shape of this flower. I'm making it a little smaller. And it's always kind of hard to do because I love the brightness of that flower, and you kind of tend to get attached to different things in your painting, and oh, but I really like that, I want to keep it. But if it doesn't work in what you're trying to say in the overall painting, what the story you're telling, it needs to be edited out. If you did it once, you can do it again. So in another painting, you can come back in and do that, whatever element was that you liked so much. So now I'm coming in with the darker colors and integrating those two, putting a little bit of that color both in the flowers that I was okay with and in that one, and blending those two together. Again, I was trying to go for some lighter areas where the sun is hitting, this side of that flower, so going in with some lighter yellows, some lighter oranges, just in these random shapes. Now this flower over here, I didn't like the simplicity of it. It needed a little more texture to it, a little more interest, and the shape itself was just too even. It needed something to break up those edges a little bit so they weren't so geometric. So that's all I'm doing with that. And again, this little bottom flower area, I just decided it needed to be darker and not pop out so much. So I'm just coming in with some darker colors and filling that in a kind of a random way. At this point, I'm not even looking at the reference photo because what I'm doing is not really on the reference photo. I'm just addressing some compositional issues. So there we go. Just kind of added some texture to that area and some shapes. Coming back in with that shadowed green color underneath the flowers and defining their edges and their forms. Now I'm coming in, taking care of that little dark spot that was just as dark as my focal point areas, which I didn't like. So I'm just lightening it up, and now all of a sudden, when I did that little dark area against the light area against my focal point flower, all of a sudden that just, your eye went straight there, because that's the darkest dark. Just a few more little things on that little bud area. Again, I don't want it to stand out. I just want it to read as those interesting little buds that are so characteristically geraniums. I really hope you have enjoyed this little series, and we'll go out and take some pictures of your own, and try to paint your own geraniums or whatever flowers are growing in your yard. In the process, you'll enjoy yourself immensely and get to know the flowers, and the world is just a better place all around. I have a teaching website, paintwithkarenalari.com, and it's a free website, and you can share your paintings and interact with other painters that are learning and more experienced, and even get critiques on the paintings that you are doing. And I would like to invite you to join me and the other artists on that website. You can also find my original paintings for sale on Etsy, and check out my website at karenalari.com. There are links to all those other things there. Just finishing off some finishing highlights. And of course, the last thing that we always do is put our signature on the bottom. A little bit of blending out. And softening those edges. All the little details. The last half of the painting sometimes takes a lot longer than the first half. More looking involved. Alright, so down to the signature, using my little rigger brush. And thank you so much for joining me. And I hope I see you on my website, paintwithkarenalari.com. Happy painting.